Brakes are one of the things we're asked about the most here at GMBN Tech. How much power do you need? How much power should you have? In particular, looking at things like smaller rotors, bigger rotors, 2-pot brakes, 4-pot brakes. Well, we're going to put an end to this today because I've got a telemetry system bolted to my bike, as you can see behind me here. We've got Spanish hillside, we've got an enduro trail, we've got an uplift driver, and we're going to do as many runs as we need to with a variety of setups to find out exactly what is the best option. We're working with Magura brakes to make this video. They make really versatile brakes across the board. Everything from super lightweight 160mm rotor and 2-pot racing cross-country brakes, all the way through to 4-pot 220mm rotor heavy-duty downhill brakes. Now, one of the most important things with hydraulic brakes on a mountain bike is matching the correct brake for the usage that you're going to be doing. For example, you're not going to want to put a 200mm rotor and a 4-pot brake on a cross-country bike. You're just going to be locking up the wheels as soon as you touch the brake levers, essentially, and vice versa. You don't want to put 160mm rotors and 2-pot brakes on a downhill bike, well, at least not if you're planning on stopping, because they're just not going to be fit for purpose. So for this trailside experiment with the 4 different brake setups I'm going to be running, I've obviously got a pretty sophisticated setup on the bike here. So this is Steve from Suspension Doctor. Can you just break down what's going on? Because as well as what I can see on the bars that are like sensors for the brake levers, you've got one on the fork here, there's also one on the shock on the right hand side of the bike, and like a control unit, I guess, at the front. Can you just tell us what they're going to do to help us sort of understand what's going on with the brakes?
So these, mainly what we're going to be using for the braking is these proximity sensors fixed to the lever and the bars. This is going to measure how much stroke we're using, how often you're using it, and how hard you're pulling the brakes, or how far through the stroke you're pulling the brakes, which will tell us how hard you're actually braking. We can also use like total time on the brake on a set track. We can use longest brake times. And we've also got a few extra tools, measure water temperatures, that kind of stuff. Yeah. Just to get a good idea of what's going on.
And I'm sure, so obviously that's going to help us understand where I'm braking, how hard. So I would take a guess that I'm going to be braking longer and for harder with a smaller rotor and a less capable brake, for example. But how does the suspension units come into the equation here?
So the suspension units measure what's happening in line with the dampers, with the shock and the fork. That is then translated to what's happening at the axle. So for setting your suspension up, you use the axle positions, axle speeds and compression and rebound. And you basically balance them out, make sure it's fast enough, make sure you're in the right spring, make sure you've got good average position, you're not bottoming out all the time, you're using enough travel frequently enough.
Okay, so I guess you're taking everything out of the equation.
Yeah, you don't guess anything like.
Yeah. So as you can see, a pretty tech setup we got here for this experiment. I'm going to do as many runs as we need to do to get enough information on each of the setups. So as I'm going to explain a bit later in the video, there's 4 different setups we're going to be using. I kind of have an idea where we're going to go with this, but it'll be super interesting to see what my thoughts are compared to like the hard data. Yeah, it should be good. Let's get to it. So the trail we're using for this experiment is in the hills of Mijas, just above Malaga. Now the trail is around 2 minutes long, give or take. It's really rocky in places. It's extremely loose as well. And there's some sections where you're really quite hard on the brakes, so perfect for seeing what the brakes are doing in different situations. Now it's around 2 minutes long, like I said, and the uplift for this is just a fraction longer. So it's ideal for doing back-to-back runs. For this experiment, we're using my Canyon Spectral. It's 150mm travel front and rear, pretty typical trail bike with 29-inch wheels. And I've put a coil shock on the rear, so for this experiment we can just remove out of the equation any sort of inconsistencies in performance, just so we can focus on what the brakes are doing. Now, unfortunately we can't run 160mm rotors on the bike because you just can't fit rotors that small on most trail bikes. So we're starting with the 180mm rotors front and rear, and we're going to be running the MT8 SL, which is a 2-pot brake, super lightweight actually, 195 grams, designed for cross-country racing, carbon fibre lever, 1-finger blade. Everything about them is designed to be super light and efficient. We're also going to be running a more powerful 4-pot brake. We'll talk about that once it's on the bike. And then we're going to switch up to 200 and 220mm rotors and run the same 2 sets of brakes again. So we've got 4 different setups there, enough variables with the telemetry system there to hopefully figure out exactly what's going on. When we're talking about the type of brakes to suit types of riding genre, think about it like this. Cross-country bikes are all about maximum efficiency. They're never trying to powerfully stop out on the trail. It's always about fine-tuning what they're doing and maximising on rolling speed. As a result of this, the bikes are super fast and super lightweight. Accordingly, the brakes need to reflect this. The carbon lever blade on the MT8 SLs is ultra light, and to go along with this, the big 2-piston calipers offer a surprising amount of power despite their minimal form. Combine this with 160mm rotors and out-push 180mm rotors, you have the perfect setup for a lightweight cross-country bike. And then there's the needs of enduro, trail and downhill riders who all need powerful brakes to suit what they're doing. The 4-piston design of the MT7s really does offer maximum stopping power, but also the benefits of spreading out the heat. Heat dissipation is one of the biggest things needed in powerful disc brakes. The cooler they can remain, the longer the braking power stays consistent. Combine this with much bigger disc rotor sizes. At the minimum, you're looking at 180, and at the top end, a huge 220mm. And you've got brakes that really do suit the style of riding. And let's also not forget our e-biker friends. E-bikes are seriously heavy-duty bikes, and they need the maximum braking power possible. The same sort of spec brakes that you expect to see on the downhill bikes. Okay, so to start the experiment, what I wanted to do is start with, in theory, what's the weakest setup? I certainly didn't want to go in hard and go the opposite way around. So we're going for the 2-pot, the super lightweight race brake there on the 180mm rotors front and rear. And down on the bottom left of the screen, you can see a small representation of just some of the information that BYB telemetry captures. What you're looking at here is a graph indicating when I'm braking, and as you can see, I'm braking quite a lot. You can also see as it peaks just how hard I'm having to brake. Part of this is learning the track as well. There's a lot to consider. Riding a new track, different conditions from what I normally ride back home. In fact, it couldn't be more different. It's the fact you're sliding around on rock here, whereas back home I'm riding in muddy conditions. So you're moving around on the bike in a completely different way. Now we have a number of runs under our belt on the 2-pot 180mm setup. I'm going to keep those 180mm rotors on the bike, and then we're going to upgrade the actual brake to the 4-pot system, so the heavier duty brakes with more power on the same size rotors. For the heavier duty brakes, I've chosen the MT7 Pro. It's a 4-piston design, so more power can be delivered and the heat spread out over a larger area. This is a heavier duty brake setup designed to handle the heat better. The sort of heat, in fact, that racers like Loic Bruni can put through a brake system. Need I say more? Now, although these brakes are heavier, they weigh just 255 grams each. Okay, and all change at this point, we're going for the 220mm, the massive rotor on the front, paired up with the 203 on the rear. And I'm going to start with the big rotor setup by using the weaker brakes, at least in theory. So we're going for the 2-pot setup. Now this front 220 rotor, as you might have noticed, looks completely different to the 180s and the 203 I'm using. Now this is an e-bike certified rotor that can handle immense heat, so it's going to be really interesting, as well as the increased braking power it could give, just to see how it deals with the heat. So running a 2-pot setup here with 220 and 203mm rotors. Now instantly I'm able to lock the wheels up way easier, which actually is causing me a few problems trying to get used to the track again, because I kind of got a bit of a grip on it yesterday, but now I'm finding like over braking, it's sending me into some areas I just don't want to be. But pretty interesting, there's just so much going on to consider, and I kind of need to not be thinking about it and just focus on the runs, so I'm not going to talk anymore. Better.
Good.
And finally, we're going for the monster setup. So this is the 203 rotor on the rear, that massive 220 on the front, and those super powerful 4-piston anchors. Okay, clean run. They're so much more powerful, but I'm not sure how much of that is a good thing on this bike, because I'm accidentally locking stuff up constantly. So it actually makes it kind of hard to manage in places. Okay, we'll have that one. Okay, so we've had 2 days of non-stop runs down this trail just here behind the camera, and pretty interesting stuff by all accounts. Now, a little disclaimer here, you've got to bear in mind that the trails we're riding here, extremely loose, completely different to what I normally ride, so it took a bit of time to dial into that. And obviously when you're riding loose terrain versus grippier terrain, how you use the brakes is completely different. So take this with a pinch of salt. But I want to run you through my experiences on each of the 4 setups, and then I still don't know this, but we'll see what Steve says actually happened on the bike and just see how that sort of reflects. So the first setup was the 180 rotors front and rear with the SL, the carbon lever cross-country brake with the 2 pots on there. Now, the lever feel, I've got to say, I didn't like, because of the fact it was an extremely lightweight brake, like nothing wrong with the position and things like that. The flex on the lever, but given the application we were putting it through, it's not really where you would use that brake. But the power in the brake was pretty good, I thought. I didn't really have anything to add at that stage. I was just like, yep, this is fine, other than having to get used to the fact the lever had flex in it. Yeah. So how did that sort of
quite similar on the data sort of thing. We've basically on the 2-pot with the 180, you've got lots of prolonged braking, yeah, and lots of heavy braking. You've had to pull the levers really hard and for quite long to get it to stop, or maybe your confidence in it not having as much modulation, you've had to pull really hard, yeah, and really long to get the bike to slow down.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point actually. So the difference between the 4-pot and the 2-pot brake, I didn't find too much difference how it emotionally felt on the trail in terms of power, but the way I could use the brake was really different. It felt that the 2-pot brake, I could lock the front wheel a little bit too easily. It felt a bit more on and off. Yeah. So maybe I wasn't using it.
Because there was that lack of modulation and power outright, yeah, I think you're pulling really hard, and then that's pushing really hard on the caliper, yeah, and then it's just grabbing because you've got no grip on the ground. Yeah,
and obviously take into account the longer I was riding for, started to learn the trail in different ways, but also the trail degraded as well. So yeah, there's a lot of different factors here. But then we moved on to the 4-pots, so that's the MT8 brake. The lever, even though like the body of the lever is fundamentally the same, just the alloy lever felt completely different, and I instantly felt at home using that. So that was the same 180 rotors front and rear, and I felt more confident using it. I felt like I could use the brake when I needed to without sort of risking locking up the front wheel quite as much. And I think I was more conscious of using both the brakes a bit more with that setup.
On the 4-pots, you were definitely more confident on the front brake. Okay. Being able to use the brakes for shorter amounts of times, but being more, not having to squeeze the lever as hard, but getting more power out of it.
Yeah, really to summarise with the 180 rotors and 2 different setups, it didn't feel to me that there was any difference in terms of the braking power that I had. Again, you know, we were running with a limited run here. On a much longer run in different conditions, things can be completely different. But out of the 2 setups, I felt more at home with the smaller rotors and the more powerful brake. I think it just suited the way that I wanted to ride and how I could use that power. I think more notably on the front brake as well.
Yeah, pretty much what we found on the runs there, yeah. A bit more confidence in the front brake on the 4-pots. Yep. I think maybe because you've got more modulation, you're not having to pull as hard to get the same power. You can then leave the brakes off a little bit, and then you've got more confidence that you're not just going to lock up and slide the front wheel out. Yeah, and in fact, actually, after I'd learned a little bit of information early on about the way I was using the brakes with the 2-pot design, I did notice that I was off the brakes more on the 4-pots. Yeah. So I was probably using the brakes on the 2-pots more and for longer, whereas the complete opposite really of the 4-pots. So pretty interesting. Then we moved on to put the 2-pots back on the bike and put a 203 rotor on the rear and a 220 on the front, so a whopping difference here. Again, the lever flex I didn't particularly like, but the second I used the brakes, I was quite shocked at the difference in power. Obviously this can be expected moving up because you've got a much bigger disc rotor, got more leverage to slow down those wheels. But the power was quite unbelievable. The first run kind of threw my head out a bit, so just focus on getting downhill. But then I found it felt like I was able to ride quicker and not be concerned about the braking because there was more power, but it was the same thing, it was on and off power. Yeah. Again, like really heavy on the power. Yeah. So that's similar, yeah, same again, like you've got harder pulls on the front. Yeah. Well, on both you've got harder pulls on the 2-pot with the bigger rotors compared to the 4-pots with the smaller rotors. Even though you've got more leverage on with a bigger rotor, yeah, you're still pulling hard and pulling for quite a long time to get that same sort of brake, like slowing down.
Yeah, and then of course we moved up to the 4-pot brakes with the same rotor combination, so 203, 220s, and the power didn't feel any different again between the 2. I'm sure it might be very different in different conditions on longer runs, just because of the nature of having the 4-pot brakes, spreading out the power, heat dissipation and stuff. But the power, again, like with the smaller rotors, felt more usable. Not too much difference on the rear, all about the front really, for me. It made a massive difference. But, you know, extremely overkill brakes for the conditions here. Yeah, like I don't think it, you might correct me here, but I don't think it changed my overall speed in terms of how I could slow down. Just because you can only slow down so much when half the hillside's coming with you as you slow down.
On the 4-pots compared to the 2-pots on the big rotors, your average speeds are similar, so your run times were all pretty similar throughout the full experiment. But on the big 4-pots, you were leaving braking till later, so your braking events were shorter, and your max speeds were higher as well. Okay. So you're actually travelling a bit faster having
So
more
actually
confidence
quite
in
a
the brakes.
difference then between the two brakes.
Yeah.
Okay, well that's, you know, I wouldn't have known that actually riding it because they, like I said, the power felt pretty similar. So I'm off the brakes more on the 4-pot with the bigger rotors, and then using them harder for a shorter time.
Yeah.
Okay, so we kind of know what's going on the sort of 4 different setups now. Just to emphasise, in case you hadn't realised already, the setup that I think worked best for me, I'm 92.5 kilos thereabouts, was the 4-pots with the 180 rotors. It felt like I could use the brakes, it felt like I could actually pull on the brakes quite hard. I just felt confident with them essentially, but we haven't referenced yet the temperature of the brakes. So Steve was also taking temperatures of the brakes the second I came off the hill, every single time, front and rear, with all different setups. So what information have we got with these?
Probably as to be expected. The smaller rotors seemed to get, your braking events got longer on both calipers, got longer towards the end, so you were getting a little bit of fade. Maybe it's not noticeable, but you were having to brake a bit longer to get that same deceleration. The bigger rotors were staying cooler, probably most of the way down, so when you were getting towards the end you weren't having to pull as hard or for as long. Yeah,
okay, I mean that kind of figures. Braking harder earlier on, braking for longer, and I guess the whole marginal gains thing that pro racers would look for is being off the brakes, but from my perspective I think I've learned a lot about that, you know, and actually thinking about where my braking points are. So matching the braking power that you can get from brakes is, you know, I don't think I understood the relevance of it before speaking to you about this stuff. I think it's really important actually. Okay, so let's flip all the way back to the beginning of the video and just think about the original questions that we're trying to answer here for Magura, and of course all the people who keep asking us is, do you want to go for a bigger disc rotor to get more power, or do you want to go for the bigger caliper, and you know, which combination is actually going to be best for people looking for stuff? What can we summarise from this?
For summary, if you're on say a 180 rotor and you're not struggling with power at the start of the run, the brake's powerful enough, but you're getting towards the end of the run and you're starting to feel like you need to pull a lot harder and a lot less predictable, you've got to be on the brakes a lot longer, chances are they're overheating, so a bigger rotor would be a better upgrade in that case. So it's going to spread
the heat out essentially.
So if you suffer from power or lack of power initially, upgrading to a 4-pot will solve that problem. Especially if you're not suffering on the long runs.
Yeah, and I guess, so, you know, this is kind of subjective because a lighter rider is going to be a completely different effect as well. So you can almost be infinite with the amount of testing.
It's the same as if you ride somewhere that's really dry and grippy. You can get away with having smaller calipers, less powerful calipers with bigger rotors, because you're managing the heat better, but you're not having to have that modulation. Whereas if you're on slippy terrain or loose terrain like we were here, you kind of want that confidence in the modulation to stop the brake from locking up and breaking traction.
Yeah, okay, well, so much information there to process, I'm sure. I'd love to know what combinations you're using. Are you using 2-pot, 4-pot, small rotors, big rotors, a mixture of rotor sizes? What works for you? Let us know in the comments underneath. There will certainly be some more videos following on this sort of trail side testing, experimental sort of phase using some telemetry and stuff. I think it's super interesting. I'd love to know what you think. Give us a thumbs up and we'll see you in the next video. See you later.